The morning sun was just starting to peek over the mountains when Jake pulled his old pickup truck into the dusty parking area of Broken Arrow Ranch. He'd been making this same drive for 15 years now, and he could probably do it with his eyes closed. The gravel crunched under his boots as he walked toward the barn, his spurs making that familiar jingling sound that meant another day of work was about to begin. Jake wasn't your typical cowboy from the movies. His face was weathered like old leather from spending most of his life outdoors. His hands were rough and calloused from handling ropes and fixing fences and wrestling with stubborn cattle. At 42, he'd seen just about everything a ranch could throw at a person. He'd pulled calves in the middle of snowstorms, chased runaway horses across 3 counties, and fixed more broken equipment than he could count. The other ranch hands were already gathering around the coffee pot when Jake walked into the main building. There was Tommy, who'd been there almost as long as Jake and could rope a steer faster than most people could blink. Then there was old Pete, who knew every inch of the ranch's 5,000 acres like it was his own backyard. And Rick, the youngest of the bunch at 25, who was still learning but had the kind of natural instinct with animals that couldn't be taught. The boss, Mr. Henderson, came out of his office with that look on his face that meant he had news. Henderson was a fair man who'd inherited the ranch from his father and actually cared about both his animals and his workers. He wasn't one of those owners who sat in an office all day while other people did the real work. "Boys, I've got something to tell you," Henderson said, pouring himself a cup of coffee that looked strong enough to wake the dead. "We're getting some help around here. New hand starts today." The cowboys exchanged glances. New people came and went pretty regularly at ranches like this one. Most folks had romantic ideas about cowboy life from watching too many Western movies. They thought it was all about riding horses into sunsets and looking tough in a hat. They never expected the reality of getting up at 4 in the morning to check on sick animals, or spending 12 hours in the saddle in weather that could freeze your bones or melt your brain. "Where's this one from?" Tommy asked, already sounding skeptical. "East Coast," Henderson replied. "Says she's got experience." That got everyone's attention. A woman ranch hand wasn't unheard of, but it wasn't exactly common either. And someone from the East Coast claiming to have ranch experience? That was like saying you learned to swim by reading books about water. "She?" Pete raised an eyebrow. "Well, that's different." "Now don't go making judgments before you meet her," Henderson warned. Though Jake could tell even the boss wasn't entirely convinced this was going to work out. She sounded determined on the phone, said she'd worked on farms back east. Jake snorted quietly. Farms back east were about as similar to a Montana cattle ranch as a goldfish was to a shark. Sure, they both involved animals and land, but that's where the similarities ended. Out here, you had to deal with weather that could kill you, animals that weighed 10 times what you did, and country so rough it could break your neck if you weren't careful. About an hour later, they heard a car engine that definitely didn't belong to any vehicle that had ever been on a ranch before. Through the window, Jake watched a shiny blue sedan pull up, looking like it had just rolled off a car lot. The woman who got out was clearly not from around here. She was small, maybe 5.5 feet tall, with black hair pulled back in a ponytail. She wore jeans that looked like they'd never seen a day of real work, and boots that were so clean they practically sparkled in the morning sun. Everything about her screamed city person trying to play dress-up as a cowgirl. Jake had seen this exact scenario play out dozens of times before. Someone would show up thinking ranch work was going to be some kind of adventure, like summer camp for adults. They'd last a few days, maybe a week if they were particularly stubborn, and then they'd disappear back to whatever comfortable life they'd come from. It was almost predictable enough to set your watch by. "That must be her," Tommy said, trying not to laugh. The woman walked toward the building with determined steps, though Jake noticed she was already looking a little uncertain as she took in the size of the place. The Broken Arrow wasn't the biggest ranch in Montana, but it was big enough to make city folks feel pretty small pretty quickly. Henderson went out to meet her, and Jake and the others followed, partly out of curiosity and partly because they had work to do anyway. Up close, she looked even more out of place. Her hands were soft and pale, with fingernails that had never been broken by honest work. She introduced herself with a firm handshake and a smile that was probably meant to look confident but came across as nervous. "I'm really excited to be here," she said, looking around at the buildings and corrals like she was seeing something from another planet. "I know I have a lot to learn, but I'm ready to work hard." Jake almost felt sorry for her. She seemed nice enough, and there was something in her eyes that suggested she genuinely wanted to be here. But wanting something and being able to do it were two completely different things. Ranch work wasn't the kind of job you could figure out by being enthusiastic. It required strength, skill, and most importantly, experience that could only come from years of making mistakes and learning from them. Henderson started showing her around, explaining how things worked. Jake watched as her eyes got wider and wider. When they got to the horse barn, Henderson pointed out Thunder, a big gray gelding that was known for being gentle with beginners. Even Thunder looked enormous next to her. "Have you done much riding?" Henderson asked. "Some," she replied, though her voice suggested that some might have meant a pony ride at a fair. When she was 10 years old, that's when Jake made his decision. As soon as Henderson and the new woman were out of earshot, he turned to the other cowboys with a grin. "All right, boys, what do you say we make this interesting?" he said. "I'm betting she doesn't make it through the week. She be gone by Sunday." "Guaranteed. What kind of bet?" Rick asked, always eager to make some easy money. $20 says she quits before Sunday dinner," Jake said. "Any takers?" Tommy thought about it for a moment. "I'll take that bet, but I say she makes it to Wednesday. That gives her enough time to realize what she's gotten herself into." Pete shook his head. "You're both being too generous. I say she's gone by tomorrow afternoon. Soon as she realizes how early we start and how hard the work is, she'd be making excuses and heading back to whatever city she came from." They shook hands on it, each convinced they had the winning bet. Jake felt pretty confident about his chances. He'd seen this story too many times before. City people always thought they wanted the simple life until they actually had to live it. When the alarm went off at 4 in the morning and it was time to go check cattle in weather that would make a polar bear shiver, the romance of cowboy life tended to wear off pretty quickly. As the day went on, Jake kept an eye on the new woman while he went about his regular work. She followed Henderson around like a lost puppy, asking questions about everything and taking notes in a little notebook she kept in her back pocket. She tried to help with small tasks, but it was obvious she didn't know a hay bale from a feed sack when it came time to load some supplies into the truck. Jake watched her struggle with a bag of grain that couldn't have weighed more than 50 pounds. She managed to get it loaded eventually, but it took her 3 times as long as it should have. And she was breathing hard when she finished. By the end of that first day, Jake was more convinced than ever that his $20 was safe. The woman looked exhausted. Her clean clothes were dirty for the first time probably in their existence, and she had that slightly shell-shocked expression that city people always got when they realized how much work ranch life actually involved. As she drove away in her shiny sedan, Jake was already planning how he'd spend his winnings. The alarm clock buzzed at 4 in the morning, just like it had every day for the past 15 years. Jake rolled out of bed, already thinking about the day ahead. Coffee first, then checking the cattle in the south pasture, and probably watching. The new city woman realized she'd made a huge mistake. When he pulled into the ranch that Tuesday morning, he was surprised to see that shiny blue sedan already parked in its spot. Maybe she was just early because she couldn't sleep, he thought. First day nerves and all that. But as the week went on, that car was there every single morning when Jake arrived. The woman's first week was like watching a disaster movie in slow motion. On Tuesday, Henderson put her on Thunder, the gentlest horse on the ranch. Thunder was so calm and patient that they usually used him to teach little kids how to ride. But somehow, she managed to slide right off his back while they were just walking around the corral. She hit the dirt with a thud that probably rattled her teeth, but she got right back up, dusted herself off, and asked to try again. Wednesday wasn't much better. Henderson sent her out to check the water levels in the north pasture tanks, which should have been a simple job. All she had to do was ride out there, look at the tanks, and come back with a report. Simple enough that even a 10-year-old could handle it? But 3 hours later, when she still hadn't returned, Henderson had to send Jake out to find her. He found her about 2 miles off course, sitting on Thunder and looking at her phone like it might magically tell her where she was. Her face was sunburned and she looked like she was about ready to cry. "GPS doesn't work too well out here," Jake said, trying to keep the amusement out of his voice. "Too many hills and not enough cell towers." "I realized that about an hour ago," she replied, looking embarrassed but not defeated. "I was trying to figure out how to get back without bothering anyone." Jake showed her the way back to the ranch, pointing out landmarks along the way. Most people would have been humiliated by getting lost on such a simple task. But she paid attention to everything he said, asking questions about how to read the terrain and remember the way. Thursday brought a new disaster. Henderson decided to teach her about cattle, starting with the basics of telling different animals apart. He pointed to a group of animals in the nearby corral and asked her to count how many bulls versus steers they had. She stared at the cattle for a long moment, then made a guess that was so wrong it was almost funny. She'd counted 2 of the steers as bulls and missed the actual bull entirely. "That big black one there," Henderson said patiently, pointing to an animal that was obviously male to anyone who'd ever seen cattle before. "That's our bull, Hercules." She squinted at the animal, then looked back at Henderson. "How can you tell?" Jake had to walk away before he started laughing out loud. "How could you tell?" It was like asking how you could tell the difference between a car and a truck. But Henderson explained it all very seriously, and she took more notes in that little notebook of hers. Friday was the horse incident that really got everyone talking. Henderson had decided she was ready to try riding in the bigger corral, not just the small training ring. Thunder was being his usual perfect self, but somehow she managed to get turned around and ended up facing backward in the saddle. When Thunder started walking, she panicked and fell off again, landing in a pile of hay that probably saved her from serious injury. The other cowboys had started gathering to watch whenever she was working with the animals. It wasn't mean-spirited exactly, but it was like watching a comedy show. Tommy started keeping a list of all her mishaps, and Rick was taking bets on what would go wrong next. $20 says she falls in the water tank tomorrow," Rick whispered to Jake as they watched her struggle to open a gate that wasn't even latched. "You're on," Jake replied. "But I think she'd get kicked by one of the calves first." But Saturday morning came, and there was that blue sedan again, parked in its usual spot. And Sunday morning, too. When Jake saw her car on Monday of the second week, he started to feel a little puzzled. Most city people would have given up by now. Getting lost, falling off horses, and not knowing a bull from a steer should have been enough embarrassment to send anyone packing. Instead, she kept showing up every morning at dawn, ready to try again. Her clothes were getting dirtier and more worn-looking. Her hands were starting to show calluses and small cuts from handling ropes and tools. She'd stopped writing in her notebook as much and started just watching what the experienced hands were doing. Jake found himself studying her when she wasn't looking. There was something stubborn about the way she approached each task, even the ones she failed at spectacularly. When she fell off Thunder for the 3rd time, she didn't complain or make excuses. She just got back up and asked Henderson if she could try again. "Most people would have quit by now," Tommy mentioned to Jake as they watched her attempt to lasso a fence post for practice. She missed by about 6 feet, but she reeled in the rope and tried again. "Yeah, well, maybe she's just too proud to admit she made a mistake coming here," Jake replied. But even as he said it, he wasn't entirely convinced. Pride usually made people defensive and angry. This woman just seemed determined. The breaking point came on Wednesday of her 2nd week. Jake was fixing a section of fence when he heard Henderson talking to her near the horse barn. His voice was gentle but firm, the way you talk to someone you were trying to let down easy. "Listen, I appreciate your enthusiasm and I can see you're trying hard," Henderson was saying. "But maybe ranch work just isn't the right fit. There's no shame in that. Plenty of good people realize this life isn't for them. Jake couldn't see her face from where he was working, but he could hear the long pause before she answered. Mr. Henderson, I know I'm not good at this yet, she said finally. I know I've made more mistakes in 2 weeks than most people make in a year, but I'm not ready to give up. But why? Henderson asked, sounding genuinely curious. You could go back to whatever you were doing before. Probably make more money and definitely have an easier life. Another long pause. Jake found himself straining to hear her answer. Because I've never wanted anything as much as I want to learn this, she said simply. Every morning when I drive out here and see those mountains and smell the air, I know I'm where I'm supposed to be. I just need more time to prove it. Henderson didn't say anything for a moment. Then Jake heard him sigh. All right, but you need to start showing some real progress soon. I can't keep having you as a student forever. This is a working ranch, not a school. I understand, she replied. Thank you for giving me another chance. As Jake walked back toward the main building later that afternoon, he found himself thinking about that conversation. He'd expected her to make excuses or get defensive when Henderson called her out. Instead, she'd been honest about her failures and asked for another opportunity to improve. That evening, as the Cowboys were settling up their various bets about when she'd quit, Jake realized something that surprised him. He wasn't sure he wanted to win anymore. $20 wasn't worth much, but watching someone fight that hard for something they wanted was starting to mean more than money. So what do you think, Jake? Tommy asked. Still confident about that Sunday deadline? Jake looked out toward the parking area, where that blue sedan sat covered in dust and looking a lot less shiny than it had 2 weeks ago. I'm starting to think, he said slowly, that maybe we don't know her as well as we thought we did. The weather forecast had been calling for rain all week, but nobody expected what hit the Broken Arrow Ranch on that Friday evening in late April. Jake was just finishing up his dinner when the first drops started hitting his cabin window. Within minutes, those drops turned into a downpour that sounded like someone was dumping buckets of water on the rooftop by midnight. The rain was coming down so hard that Jake couldn't see his own truck parked 20 feet from his front door. The wind was howling like a freight train, and every few minutes lightning would flash, lighting up the whole valley like it was daytime. This wasn't just a spring shower. This was the kind of storm that old-timers talked about for years afterward. Jake's phone started ringing at 3 in the morning. It was Henderson, and he sounded worried. Jake, we've got problems, Henderson said, shouting to be heard over the storm. The creek's rising fast, and I think we might lose some cattle. Can you get down here? Jake was already pulling on his boots. On my way. The drive to the ranch was like navigating through a car wash. His windshield wipers couldn't keep up with the rain, and twice he had to stop because he couldn't see the road at all. When he finally made it to the main building, he found Henderson pacing back and forth, looking more stressed than Jake had seen him in years. It's bad, Jake, Henderson said as soon as Jake walked through the door. Real bad. The north pasture is starting to flood, and I think some of the cattle might have panicked and broken through the fence. We won't know for sure until this storm passes, but we could be looking at losing 30 or 40 head. 30 or 40 cattle was a lot of money, but more than that, it was 30 or 40 animals that depended on them for protection. Jake had been around livestock long enough to know that cattle could do some pretty stupid things when they got scared. They might run straight into danger while trying to get away from something that wasn't actually threatening them. Tommy and Pete showed up about 20 minutes later, both looking like they'd been dragged through a river. Rick lived further out and couldn't make it through the flooded roads. The 4 men stood around drinking coffee and watching the storm through the windows, knowing there wasn't much they could do until daylight. Worst storm I've seen in maybe 10 years? Pete said, shaking water out of his hat. Creek behind my place is already out of its banks. That's when they heard another vehicle pulling up outside. Through the rain-streaked window, Jake could make out the shape of that familiar blue sedan. A minute later, the new woman came through the door, soaked to the skin and breathing hard. I heard on the radio that there might be flooding, she said, water dripping from her hair onto the floor. I thought you might need extra help. Henderson looked surprised. How did you even get here? Half the roads are washed out. I took the back way through Miller's property, she replied. Had to get out and move a tree that fell across the road, but the car made it through. Jake found himself impressed, despite everything. The back way through Miller's property was rough on a good day. Driving it in weather like this took either courage or stupidity, and he wasn't sure which one it was. You didn't have to come out in this, Henderson said. It's dangerous. So is leaving cattle out in a flood, she replied simply. As soon as the sun came up, even though the rain was still coming down hard, Henderson started organizing search parties. The plan was to split up and check different sections of the ranch to see how many cattle were missing and where they might have gone. Jake, you take the North Canyon, Henderson said, pointing to a map spread out on the table. That's where they're most likely to be if they ran from the flooding. Pete, you check the East Ridge. Tommy, take the South Pasture. Jake was getting ready to head out when the woman stepped forward. Can I come with you? Jake looked at her like she'd suggested. They go swimming with sharks. The North Canyon's rough country on a good day. In weather like this, it's downright dangerous. I know I'm not experienced, but you might need an extra pair of eyes, she said. And if we find injured animals, having more people could make the difference. Henderson looked uncertain. Jake, what do you think? Jake's first instinct was to say no. The North Canyon was full of loose rock and steep drop-offs. In this weather, even experienced riders could get into serious trouble. But something about the way she was standing there, soaked and determined, made him hesitate. You do exactly what I tell you, he said finally. No heroics, no trying to prove anything. If I say we turn back, we turn back. Understood? Understood, she replied. Getting the horses saddled was a challenge in itself. The animals were spooked by the storm, and Thunder kept dancing around nervously while she tried to get his bridle on. Jake watched her work, expecting her to get frustrated or give up. Instead, she talked quietly to the horse, moving slowly and patiently until Thunder calmed down enough for her to finish. The ride to the North Canyon was miserable. The rain was still coming down steadily, and the wind made it feel like they were being pelted with ice. The trail was muddy and slippery, and more than once Jake had to grab Thunder's reins to keep the woman from sliding off when her horse stumbled, but she didn't complain. She didn't ask to turn back. She just kept riding, hunched over against the weather, occasionally wiping rain out of her eyes with the back of her hand. When they reached the canyon, Jake's worst fears were confirmed. The creek that usually ran gently along the bottom was now a raging torrent, and they could see at least a dozen cattle stranded on a small rise that was rapidly becoming an island. There they are, Jake said, pointing through the rain. But I don't know how we're going to get them out. That water's moving too fast to drive them through. The woman was studying the situation carefully, and Jake could almost see her thinking. After a few minutes, she pointed to a spot upstream where some fallen trees had created a natural dam. What if we could break up that logjam? She asked. It might lower the water level enough to get the cattle across. Jake looked where she was pointing. It was risky, but it might work. The problem was that someone would have to get close to that rushing water to move the logs, and one slip could be fatal. Too dangerous, he said. We'll have to find another way. What if we used ropes? She persisted. Tie them to the saddle horn and pull the logs loose from a safe distance? Jake found himself considering the idea. It wasn't the worst plan he'd ever heard, and they were running out of options. The water was still rising, and those cattle weren't going to last much longer on that little island. All right, he said finally. But we do this my way. You hold the horses and stay well back. From the water, I'll handle the ropes. Working together, they managed to pull two of the larger logs free from the jam. The water level dropped by almost 2 feet, enough to create a narrow crossing point where the current wasn't quite as fierce. Getting the cattle across was still tricky, but with Jake on one side calling them and the woman positioned to keep them from turning back, they managed to move the entire group to safety. It took almost 3 hours, and by the time they were finished, both riders and horses were exhausted as they rode back toward the ranch. Jake found himself stealing glances at his companion. Her earlier suggestion about the logjam had been smart, thinking under pressure, and she'd followed his instructions exactly, never trying to do more than he'd asked her to do, even when things got complicated. "Not bad for a city girl," he said as they approached the ranch buildings. She turned to look at him, water still dripping from her hair. "Thanks, that means a lot coming from you." For the first time since she'd arrived, Jake found himself wondering if maybe, just maybe, he'd been wrong about her. The morning after the storm, the canyon looked like a completely different place. What had been a raging torrent the day before was now just a muddy creek again, but the landscape showed scars from the flood. Trees were down everywhere, and debris was scattered across the canyon floor like someone had picked up the whole area and shaken it hard. Jake and the woman rode back out to check on the cattle they'd rescued and to look for any stragglers they might have missed. The sun was finally shining, but everything was still soaked, and steam was rising from the wet rocks as they warmed up. "Hard to believe this was all underwater yesterday," she said, looking around at the destruction. "Nature's got a way of reminding you who's really in charge," Jake replied. He'd seen floods before, but this one had been particularly nasty. They were lucky they hadn't lost any animals. They were riding along the ridge above the canyon when Jake spotted something that made his stomach drop. About halfway down the steep slope, a section of loose shale had given way, probably undermined by all the rain. It created a dangerous slide area that definitely hadn't been there the day before. "We need to mark that spot so nobody rides through there by accident," Jake said, pointing to the slide. "One wrong step and horse and rider could tumble right down into the canyon." The woman was studying the area carefully. "Should we ride around and check it from below? Make sure there aren't any injured animals down there?" It was a good suggestion. Flash floods sometimes pushed cattle into places where they got trapped or hurt. Jake nodded, and they started working their way down a safer path to the canyon floor. They were almost to the bottom when Jake heard the sound that every horseman dreads, the scraping, sliding noise of a horse losing its footing on loose rock. He spun around just in time to see Thunder stumbling on a patch of wet shale, his hooves scrambling for purchase on the slippery surface. Time seemed to slow down as Jake watched the scene unfold. Thunder's hindquarters were sliding toward the edge of a steep drop-off, and the woman was fighting to stay in the saddle. The horse was panicking now, which only made things worse. His wild movements were sending more rocks tumbling down the slope. Without thinking, Jake threw himself out of his own saddle and lunged toward Thunder's bridle. His boots slipped on the wet rocks, and for a terrifying moment he thought all three of them were going over the edge. But his hand closed around Thunder's reins just as the horse was starting to slide backward. "Easy, boy, easy," Jake said in the calmest voice he could manage, even though his heart was hammering in his chest. He planted his feet as firmly as he could on the treacherous surface and pulled with everything he had. Thunder seemed to understand that Jake was trying to help. The big gelding stopped thrashing and let Jake guide him back onto more solid ground. It took several long, scary minutes, but finally all 4 feet were on stable rock again. Jake was breathing hard as he helped the woman down from the saddle. She was shaking, whether from fear or adrenaline he couldn't tell, but she seemed unhurt. "That was close," she said, her voice not quite steady. "Too close, thank you. Are you okay?" Jake asked, looking her over for injuries. "Nothing broken?" "I'm fine, just scared." She looked at Thunder, who was still trembling from the experience. "Is he hurt?" Jake ran his hands over the horse's legs, checking for cuts or swelling. "He seems okay. Probably just shaken up, like the rest of us." They found a flat spot where they could sit down and catch their breath. Jake's hands were still shaking a little from the adrenaline rush. A few more seconds, and they could have been looking at a serious accident, maybe even a fatal one. "I need to ask you something," Jake said after they'd been sitting quietly for a few minutes, "and I want an honest answer." She looked at him with those dark eyes that seemed older than the rest of her. "Okay, why are you really here?" Jake asked. "And don't give me that story about wanting to learn ranch work. People don't put themselves through what you've been through just for a job. There's something else going on?" For a long moment she Didn't say anything? She was looking out across the canyon, and Jake could see her wrestling with whether to tell him the truth, or stick with whatever story she'd been telling everyone else. Finally, she took a deep breath. "My grandfather," she said quietly. "This is all because of my grandfather." "How so?" "His name was Chunwei Ming. He came to this country from China when he was just 17 years old. Didn't speak any English, didn't know anybody, had about $20 to his name." She paused, still looking out at the mountains. But he had a dream. He wanted to own land, to raise cattle, to be a real American rancher. Jake waited, sensing there was more to the story. He worked for other people for years, saving every penny he could. Finally, in 1943, he had enough money to buy a small ranch in Wyoming. Nothing fancy, just a few hundred acres and some buildings that were falling apart, but it was his. What happened? Jake asked, though he had a feeling the story didn't have a happy ending. The war happened. Pearl Harbor, and suddenly anyone who looked Asian was suspicious. People started saying he might be a spy, that he couldn't be trusted. The bank that held his mortgage got nervous and called in his loan early. He couldn't pay it all at once, so he lost everything. Jake felt a knot forming in his stomach. He'd heard stories like this before about how fear and prejudice had destroyed innocent people's lives during the war. He spent the rest of his life working for other ranchers, never owning his own land again. But he never stopped loving it. Even when he was old and sick, he would tell me stories about those few years when he had his own place. The way his face would light up when he talked about checking cattle in the morning, or fixing fence, or just sitting on his porch watching the sunset over his own land. She turned to look at Jake directly. "Before he died, he made me promise him something. He said the dream didn't have to die with him. He said if I ever got the chance, I should learn the life he'd been forced to give up. Not for revenge or to prove anything to anybody, but because the land doesn't care what you look like or where you came from. It only cares if you're willing to work hard and treat it with respect." Jake sat there processing what she'd just told him. Suddenly her determination made perfect sense. This wasn't about proving she could do a man's job or showing off for city friends. This was about honoring a promise to someone she'd loved, someone who'd had his dreams stolen from him. "So that's why you won't quit," he said. It wasn't a question. "I can't quit," she replied simply. "Every time I think about giving up, I remember his face when he told me those stories. I remember how much he wanted to come back to this life, and how he never got the chance." They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching clouds drift across the big Montana sky. Jake found himself seeing her completely differently now. The struggles, the persistence, the refusal to give up even when everything went wrong, it all made sense now. "He would be proud of you," Jake said finally. "I hope so," she replied. "I still have a long way to go before I really know what I'm doing." "Maybe," Jake said, standing up and brushing dust off his jeans. "But I'm starting to think you've got something that can't be taught." "What's that?" "The right reasons for being here." As they mounted up to continue their patrol, Jake realized something had changed. He wasn't just tolerating her presence anymore, or waiting for her to fail. For the first time, he was actually curious to see how far she could go. Something changed after that day in the canyon. Jake couldn't put his finger on exactly when it happened, but he found himself doing things he never expected. Instead of watching the woman struggle with her daily tasks and shaking his head, he started stepping in to show her the right way to do things. It began small. On Monday morning, he noticed her fighting with a stubborn gate latch that had a trick to it. Instead of walking past like he normally would, Jake stopped and showed her how to lift the gate slightly while turning the handle. It was such a simple thing, but he could see the relief on her face when the gate swung open easily. "Thank you," she said, practicing the motion a couple more times. "I've been wrestling with that thing for weeks. Gates around here all have their own personalities," Jake replied. "You just have to learn their quirks." The next day, he found himself explaining why they moved cattle in a certain pattern when bringing them in from the pasture. The day after that, he showed her how to read the sky for weather signs that wouldn't show up on any forecast. "See those clouds building up behind the mountains? Jake pointed to what looked like innocent white puffs to most people. The way they're stacking up means we'll probably get rain by evening. Might not seem like much, but if you're planning to fix fence in the afternoon, you'd want to know that ahead of time. She absorbed every lesson like a sponge soaking up water. What impressed Jake most was that she never asked him to repeat something. If he showed her once, she remembered it. And she started noticing things on her own, asking questions that showed she was really thinking about what she was learning. Why do the cattle always gather in that corner of the south pasture during the afternoon? She asked one day as they were riding fence. Jake looked where she was pointing. He'd seen cattle do that for years, but had never really thought about why. Shade, I guess. That's where the trees are thickest. But they're not in the shade, she pointed out. They're about 50 feet away from the trees, right where that little rise is. Jake studied the spot more carefully. She was right, the cattle weren't in the shade at all. They were on a small hill that caught the afternoon breeze. In the heat of summer, that breeze would be worth more than shade. You know what? Jake said, genuinely impressed. I think you just taught me something. I've been looking at that same spot for 15 years and never noticed they were picking the breeze over the shade. The other ranch hands started noticing the change too. Tommy mentioned it first during one of their coffee breaks. Jake's been awful helpful lately, Tommy said with a grin. Almost like he's taken that city girl under his wing. Maybe he's just tired of watching her struggle, Pete suggested. Gets painful after a while. But Rick, who was younger and paid more attention to people's moods, shook his head. Nah, it's more than that. You see how he actually listens when she asks questions now? Before, he used to just grunt and walk away. Jake tried to convince himself he was just being practical. The woman was going to be around for a while, whether he liked it or not. It made sense to help her get better at her job so she wouldn't slow everyone else down. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. The truth was, teaching her reminded him why he'd fallen in love with ranch work in the first place. When you'd been doing the same job for 15 years, it was easy to forget how amazing it could be to someone seeing it for the first time. Through her eyes, he started noticing things he'd taken for granted, like the way the morning light hit the mountains just as the sun came up, turning them pink and gold for about 10 minutes before settling into their usual blue-gray color. Or how the cattle had different personalities just like people. Some were leaders, some were followers, some were troublemakers who always tried to break away from the herd. That spotted cow there, Jake pointed out one morning as they were moving cattle to a new pasture. She's what we call a wise cow. She's been around long enough to know the routine, and the younger cattle follow her lead. If you can get her moving in the right direction, the rest will follow. The woman watched the cow carefully, studying how she moved and how the other cattle responded to her. It's like she's the teacher and they're her students. Exactly, Jake said. Every herd has one or two like that. Once you learn to spot them, moving cattle gets a lot easier. What really surprised Jake was how quickly she started picking up the subtle skills that usually took years to develop. Reading animal behavior, understanding how weather affected the land, knowing when something was wrong just by the feel of it. These weren't things you could learn from books or videos. They came from experience and instinct. One afternoon, they were checking water tanks in the east pasture when she suddenly pulled up her horse and frowned. Something's wrong, she said, looking around. Jake stopped too, following her gaze. Everything looked normal to him. The cattle were grazing peacefully, the water tank was full, the fence was intact. What do you mean? I don't know, something just feels off. She was still scanning the area, and Jake could see she was genuinely troubled by whatever she was sensing. Jake had learned to trust that kind of instinct, even if he couldn't see what was wrong. They rode a slow circle around the area, and that's when they found it. One section of fence had a loose post that wasn't visible from where they'd been sitting. It hadn't fallen yet, but it would have within a day or two, and when it did, it would have created a gap big enough for cattle to wander through. How did you know? Jake asked as they worked together to tighten the post. I'm not sure, she admitted. The cattle seemed nervous, maybe? Like they were avoiding this corner of the pasture. Jake looked at the cattle, who were indeed staying well away from the weak fence section. He probably would have noticed it eventually, but it might have taken him another hour of looking around. Her instincts had spotted the problem in minutes. That's not something you can teach someone, Jake said, impressed. Either you have that kind of awareness or you don't. As the weeks went on, Jake found himself looking forward to working with her. She asked good questions, picked up new skills quickly, and never complained about the hard work or long hours. More than that, she seemed to genuinely love what she was doing. When they found a newborn calf one morning, weak and struggling to stand, Jake watched her face light up as they helped it get on its feet and find its mother. When they fixed a water line that had been giving the cattle trouble for weeks, she looked as satisfied as if she'd just solved world hunger. "You know," Jake said one evening as they were finishing up the day's work, "I owe you an apology." "For what?" "For assuming you wouldn't last a week. For thinking you were just some city person playing cowgirl." "I was wrong about you?" She smiled, and Jake realized it was the first time he'd seen her look truly relaxed since she'd arrived. "I don't blame you for thinking that. I probably looked pretty hopeless when I first got here." "Maybe," Jake admitted. "But looking hopeless and being hopeless are two different things. It just took me a while to figure that out." As they walked toward their vehicles, Jake realized that the woman wasn't just learning how to be a ranch hand. She was becoming one. And somewhere along the way, without him really noticing, she'd stopped being Henderson's problem or the other cowboy's entertainment. She'd become his partner. The call came in on a Tuesday morning while Jake was having his coffee and checking the weather forecast. It was Bill Matthews from the Circle M Ranch, and he sounded frantic. "Jake, I need your help," Bill said, without even saying hello first. "We've got a disaster over here. Our fence line with the broken arrow came down during that windstorm last night, and now our cattle are all mixed up together. I've got about 200 heads scattered across both properties, and I can't tell which ones are mine and which ones are yours." Jake set down his coffee cup and grabbed a pen. "How bad is it?" "Bad enough that it's going to take all day to sort out if we do it the usual way. Maybe longer. And I've got buyers coming to look at my cattle tomorrow morning. If I can't show them the right animals, I'm going to lose a big sale." This was the kind of problem that could happen to any rancher, but it was always a nightmare to deal with. Cattle from different herds didn't like being separated once they'd mixed together. They'd fight the process every step of the way, making the work twice as hard as it needed to be. "I'll be over in an hour," Jake promised. "Let me round up some help." Jake found Henderson in the main office, already dealing with paperwork from yesterday's feed delivery. When Jake explained the situation, Henderson nodded grimly. "Take whoever you need," Henderson said. "Bill's been a good neighbor for 20 years. We help him out when he needs it." Jake was heading toward the bunkhouse to find Tommy and Pete when he spotted the woman coming out of the horse barn. She'd been there since before dawn, working with Thunder on some new riding techniques Jake had shown her the day before. "Emergency at the Circle M," Jake called to her. "Mixed herds. You want to come help, or would you rather stay here and work on fence repair?" To his surprise, she didn't hesitate. "I'll come. What happened?" As they loaded horses into the trailer, Jake explained the problem. Mixed herds were tricky because cattle formed social groups, and when those groups got scrambled, the animals became stressed and unpredictable. "The key is to work slowly and let them sort themselves out as much as possible," Jake said as they drove toward the Circle M. "Push too hard, and they'll just get more confused." When they arrived at Bill's ranch, Jake could see the problem immediately. The fence between the two properties had come down along about a quarter-mile stretch, and cattle were wandering freely back and forth. Some of Henderson's Black Angus were mixed in with Bill's Herefords, and the animals looked agitated and confused. Bill came out to meet them, looking like he hadn't slept much. "I've been out here since sunrise trying to get a handle on this, but every time I get a group moving in the right direction, they split up and go 3 different ways." Jake surveyed the situation while Tommy and Pete unloaded the horses. It was going to be a long day, but it was doable if they approached it right. "What we need to do," Jake said, thinking out loud, is set up a temporary holding area and sort them gradually. Trying to separate them while they're all scattered is just going to make things worse. That's when the woman spoke up. What if we used the natural behavior instead of fighting against it? Everyone turned to look at her. Bill obviously didn't know who she was, and Jake could see him wondering why they'd brought someone so inexperienced to help with such a complicated job. "What do you mean?" Jake asked. "Well, you said cattle form social groups, right? So some of these animals probably already know each other, even across the two herds. What if we identified the animals that seemed calm and confident and used them to lead the others?" Jake thought about it. It wasn't a standard approach, but it made sense. Go on. Instead of trying to force them into groups by ownership, we could let them form natural groups first, then sort those groups. It might take longer initially, but the animals would be less stressed, so they'd be easier to work with. Bill looked skeptical. "I've never heard of doing it that way." "Neither have I," Jake admitted. "But that doesn't mean it won't work." They decided to try her approach. Instead of immediately trying to separate the cattle by ranch, they spent the first hour just observing how the animals naturally grouped themselves. Sure enough, certain cattle seemed to act as leaders, staying calm while others gathered around them. "There," the woman pointed to a big Hereford bull who had about 15 other cattle clustered near him. "He's keeping that whole group calm. And that black cow over there has another group following her lead." Working with these natural groups turned out to be much easier than trying to force arbitrary divisions. The calm leader animals didn't fight being moved, and their followers came along willingly. Within 2 hours, they had most of the cattle organized into manageable groups. The sorting process still took time, but it went smoother than anyone had expected. When they found cattle that clearly belonged to the wrong group, the animals were calm enough to be moved without creating chaos. "This is working better than I thought it would," Bill admitted as they worked through the afternoon. Usually this kind of job turns into a rodeo with cattle running everywhere and everyone getting frustrated. By late afternoon, they had successfully separated all the cattle and repaired the fence line. What should have been an all-day disaster was finished with time to spare. "I owe you folks a big thank you," Bill said as they loaded up to leave. "That idea about working with the natural groups instead of against them, that was brilliant. I'm definitely going to remember that for next time." On the drive back to the Broken Arrow, Jake found himself thinking about what had happened. The woman's suggestion had saved them hours of work and probably prevented injuries to both cattle and cowboys. More importantly, she'd seen a solution that none of the experienced hands had thought of. "That was good thinking back there," Jake said. "Where did that idea come from?" "I'm not sure," she replied. "I was just watching how the animals were behaving and thinking about what you taught me about cattle psychology. It seemed like fighting. Their natural instincts was making everything harder." When they got back to the ranch, Henderson was waiting to hear how things had gone. As Jake described the day's events, he found himself emphasizing the woman's contribution to solving the problem. "Interesting approach," Henderson said thoughtfully. "Bill's going to tell that story to every rancher in the county. Word gets around when someone comes up with a better way to do things." That evening, as Jake was getting ready to head home, Henderson called him into the office. "Jake, I need to talk to you about something," Henderson said, closing the door behind them. "I've been watching how things have been going lately, and I'm impressed with the progress our new hand has been making." "She's come a long way," Jake agreed. "More than that," Henderson continued. "She's starting to contribute ideas that make the whole operation run better. That business today with the mixed herds, that's the kind of thinking I want to see from my senior people." Jake wasn't sure where this conversation was heading, but he had a feeling it was going to be significant. "I've been considering creating a new position," Henderson said. "Assistant foreman. Someone who can help coordinate the daily operations and bring fresh thinking to old problems. I was wondering what you'd think about her taking on that role." Jake felt a strange mix of emotions. Pride in how far she'd come, surprise at how quickly Henderson had recognized her potential, and something else he couldn't quite identify. "She'd be my equal?" Jake asked. In terms of authority and responsibility, yes. You'd still be the senior foreman, but she'd be your partner in running things day to day. Jake thought about all the times over the past few weeks when working with her had made his own job easier and more enjoyable. About how her fresh perspective had helped him see familiar problems in new ways. "I think," he said slowly, "that might be the best idea you've had in a long time." The summer had been the driest anyone could remember. By late July, the grass in the pastures was brown and brittle, crackling under the horses' hooves like old newspaper. The creek that usually ran year-round was down to a trickle, and the cattle had to walk farther each day to find decent grazing. Jake had been watching the weather reports religiously, hoping for rain that never came. Every morning he'd check the sky for clouds, and every morning he'd see nothing but endless blue stretching from horizon to horizon. The few times clouds did appear, they'd drift over without dropping so much as a sprinkle. Worst drought in 30 years, Henderson said one morning as they discussed moving cattle to different pastures. "My dad used to tell stories about summers like this, but I never thought I'd see one myself." The woman had been promoted to assistant foreman 3 weeks earlier, and she'd thrown herself into the job with the same determination she'd shown when learning to ride. She'd taken over scheduling the daily work assignments and had started keeping detailed records of which pastures were holding up best under the drought conditions. "The north pasture still has some decent grass left," she reported during their morning meeting, "but the south pasture is pretty much done. We're going to need to move those cattle soon." It was a Tuesday afternoon when Jake first smelled smoke in the air. At first, he thought maybe someone was burning brush somewhere, but the smell kept getting stronger. By evening, there was a thin haze hanging over the mountains to the east. The official word came. Wednesday morning, through the county emergency services radio. A wildfire had started in the national forest about 15 miles away. Lightning strike, they said, in an area that was bone dry and full of dead timber. The fire was spreading fast. How big? Henderson asked when Jake relayed the information. "They're saying maybe 500 acres so far, but it's growing. Winds pushing it west, toward the valley." By Thursday, the smoke was thick enough that they had to keep the barn lights on during the day. The cattle were getting nervous, moving restlessly and staying bunched up instead of spreading out to graze. Even the horses seemed on edge. Friday morning brought the news everyone had been dreading. The fire had jumped a creek and was now covering over 3,000 acres. Worse, the wind had shifted and it was heading directly toward their valley. The county sheriff drove out to the ranch personally to deliver the evacuation order. Jake had known Sheriff Williams for years, and he'd never seen the man look so grim. "You folks need to be out of here by 6 o'clock tonight," Williams said. "No exceptions. This fire is moving faster than anyone expected, and we can't guarantee we'll be able to get people out if they wait much longer." Henderson looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. "What about the livestock?" "Take what you can, but don't risk human lives for animals." "That's an order." After the sheriff left, the ranch fell into a strange kind of controlled chaos. Everyone knew what needed to be done, but there was too much to do and not enough time. To do it, they could load some of the horses into trailers, but there was no way to evacuate 500 head of cattle. "We could drive the cattle to the Peterson place," Tommy suggested. "They've got that big pasture on the other side of the river. That's 20 miles, Pete pointed out. We'd never make it before dark, and driving cattle at night with a fire coming is suicide." Henderson was making phone calls, trying to arrange emergency transport for as many animals as possible. But even if every truck and trailer in the county was available, they couldn't move all the livestock in time. That's when Jake made a decision that surprised even himself. "I'm staying," he announced. Everyone stopped what they were doing and stared at him. "You're what?" Henderson said. "Someone needs to stay with the animals. We can't just abandon them." Jake's voice was calm, but there was steel in it. "I'll take a skeleton crew and do what we can to protect the livestock in the buildings." "Jake, that's crazy," Tommy said. "The sheriff said the fire could be here by tomorrow morning." "Maybe, maybe not. Fire's unpredictable. And if we can keep the buildings..." Wet and move the cattle to the safest areas, we might be able to ride it out. Henderson looked torn. I can't ask you to risk your life for this place. You're not asking, I'm volunteering. That's when the woman stepped forward. I'm staying too. Jake spun around to face her. No, absolutely not. Why not? She asked. Her chin set in that stubborn way Jake had learned to recognize. Because this is dangerous, really dangerous. People die in wildfires. People die in car accidents too, but that doesn't stop you from driving to work every day. Henderson held up his hands. Now, wait a minute, both of you. This isn't a decision anyone should make lightly. I'm not making it lightly, the woman said. I'm making it because this ranch is my responsibility too now. You made me assistant foreman, which means I help make the hard decisions. Jake felt his temper rising. This isn't about proving you're tough enough. This is about survival. No, she said quietly. This is about not abandoning the things we care about when they need us most. The words hit Jake harder than he expected. He recognized something in her voice, the same tone she'd used when talking about her grandfather's lost ranch. You've proved your point, Jake said, his voice softer now. You don't need to die for it. I'm not staying to prove anything to you anymore, Jake. She looked around at the ranch buildings, the corrals, the pastures where cattle were grazing, peacefully, unaware of the danger approaching. This place has become my home, and you don't abandon home when it needs you most. The simple honesty in her words stopped Jake's arguments cold. He understood exactly what she meant because he felt the same way. This ranch wasn't just a job to him. It was 15 years of his life, 15 years of sweat and satisfaction and the kind of deep contentment that came from doing work that mattered. Henderson was quiet for a long moment, looking back and forth between them. Finally, he sighed. If, you're determined to do this, I'm not going to stop you. But I want satellite phones, regular check-ins, and an escape route planned. At the first sign that things are going bad, you get out, no heroics. Understood, Jake and the woman said at the same time. As the sun set that evening, Jake watched the evacuation convoy disappear down the valley road, red taillights fading into the smoky distance. The ranch felt eerily quiet without the usual bustle of activity. Tommy had volunteered to stay as well, along with Pete, despite his wife's objections. 4 people to protect 500 cattle and dozens of buildings. It should have felt hopeless, but somehow it didn't. Well, the woman sighed, looking up at the orange glow on the eastern horizon where the fire was burning. I guess we'd better get to work. As they started setting up sprinklers and moving the most valuable horses to the safest areas, Jake realized something that surprised him. For the first time since she'd arrived at the ranch, he wasn't worried about her ability to handle what was coming. She'd stopped being someone he felt responsible for protecting. She'd become someone he trusted to watch his back. The fire was coming, and they were going to face it together. The fire came just after midnight on Saturday. Jake was dozing in the main building when the satellite phone rang, jolting him awake. It was the county fire coordinator with an update that made his blood run cold. The fire jumped the highway about an hour ago, the voice said through the static. It's moving faster than we predicted. You've got maybe 4 hours before it reaches your area. Are you sure you don't want to evacuate now while you still can? Jake looked out the window at the orange glow that had grown steadily brighter throughout the night. We're staying, but thanks for the warning. He woke the others, and they spent the remaining hours before dawn in a flurry of last-minute preparations. They moved the horses to the largest corral closest to the creek. They soaked every building they could with water from the irrigation system. They cleared brush and anything else that could burn from around the main structures. The woman worked alongside them without complaint, though Jake could see the fear in her eyes when she thought no one was looking. He felt it too, a cold knot in his stomach that got tighter every time he looked toward the mountains. As the sun came up, they could see the fire for the first time. A wall of orange and black smoke stretched across the eastern hills, maybe 3 miles away. The wind was pushing it toward them steadily, and Jake could hear the distant roar of flames consuming everything in their path. How long do you think We have? Tommy asked, his voice tight with nervousness. Maybe 2 hours, Jake replied. Maybe less if the wind picks up. They spent those 2 hours moving cattle to the areas they'd identified as safest, the pastures closest to water sources, and farthest from heavy timber. It was exhausting work, made worse by the smoke that was getting thicker by the minute. The cattle knew something was wrong. They kept trying to break away from the group, heading in different directions as their instincts told them to run. It took all 4 riders working together to keep the herd moving in the right direction. "This isn't working," Pete shouted over the noise of bawling cattle. "They're too spooked. We're going to lose them." That's when the woman had an idea that probably saved them all. "What if we stop fighting their instincts?" she called to Jake. "Let them run, but guide where they run to." It was the same kind of thinking she'd used with the mixed herds weeks earlier. Instead of trying to force the cattle to stay calm, they used the animals' natural panic to move them faster toward safety. It worked. By opening gates and positioning themselves strategically, they managed to channel the running cattle toward the north pasture, the area farthest from the approaching fire. What should have taken hours of careful herding was accomplished in 30 minutes of controlled chaos. By noon, the fire was close enough that they could feel the heat on their faces when the wind shifted toward them. Ash was falling like gray snow, and the air was so thick with smoke that they had to cover their faces with wet bandanas, just to breathe. The first flames reached the ranch's eastern boundary around 1 o'clock. Jake watched from the roof of the main building as the fire consumed the fence line, moving steadily toward the buildings and corrals they'd spent the morning trying to protect. "Sprinklers are holding so far," the woman reported from below. The water was keeping the roofs and walls wet, but Jake could see that some of the outlying sheds were already starting to smolder from the radiant heat. For 3 hours, they fought a running battle with the fire. When flames reached the hay barn, they managed to save it by directing every sprinkler and hose they had at the building. When sparks started a grass fire near the horse corral, they beat it out with wet sacks and shovels. The worst moment came when the fire reached the main equipment shed. The building was too far from the water lines to protect effectively, and they could only watch as flames engulfed the structure where thousands of dollars worth of machinery and tools were stored. "We're losing it," Tommy said, his face black with soot and his voice hoarse from smoke. But then around 4 o'clock the wind began to die down. Without the constant push of air to drive it forward, the fire's advance slowed. The flames that had been racing across the landscape began to settle into a more manageable burn. "I think we might make it," Jake said, hardly daring to believe. By evening, the immediate danger had passed. The fire was still burning in the hills beyond the ranch, but it was moving away from them now, following the wind toward areas that had already been evacuated. They'd lost the equipment shed and about 50 acres of pasture on the eastern boundary. But the main buildings were intact, the livestock were safe, and most importantly, all 4 of them had survived. As they sat on the porch of the main building that night, too exhausted to do anything but watch the distant glow of the fire moving away from them, Jake found himself thinking about what they'd accomplished. "You know," he said to the woman who was sitting on the steps with her head in her hands, "I don't think I could have done this alone." She looked up at him, her face still streaked with soot. "Yes, you could have. You've been doing this kind of work your whole life." "Not this kind of work," Jake said. "This was different. The way you kept thinking of solutions when the rest of us were just reacting, that made all the difference." 3 days later, when the fire was finally contained and the evacuation orders were lifted, Henderson returned to find his ranch still standing. He walked around the property with Jake and the woman, surveying the damage and marveling at what they'd managed to save. "The insurance adjuster says we came out better than anyone." "Had a right to expect," Henderson told them. "And every rancher in the county is talking about how you folks stayed behind to protect the livestock." But Henderson had bigger news. At 68, he was finally ready to retire. His children had moved to the city years ago and had no interest in ranch life. He wanted to sell the Broken Arrow to someone who would care for it the way he had. "I've been thinking about this for months," Henderson said as they sat in his office. And after what happened with the fire, I know I want to sell to people who understand what this place really means. He looked at Jake and the woman. I'd like to offer you both the chance to buy the ranch together. Equal partners. You've already proven you can work as a team, and you've both shown you're willing to sacrifice for this place. Jake felt his heart skip a beat. Owning a ranch had been a dream he'd given up on years ago, assuming he'd never have enough money to make it happen. But as partners, with the favorable terms Henderson was offering, it might actually be possible. I need to think about this, Jake said. No, you don't, the woman said quietly. Yes, we'll do it. Jake turned to look at her. Are you sure? My grandfather dreamed of owning ranch land his whole life after he lost his place, she said. He never got that chance, but maybe his granddaughter can fulfill that dream for both of them. 6 months later, Jake Morrison and his partner stood on the porch of their ranch house, watching the sun rise over land that now belonged to them. The insurance money had paid for a new equipment shed, and they'd used their savings to buy additional cattle. The woman had changed over the months since the fire. The uncertainty was gone, replaced by the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where they belonged. She'd started wearing her grandfather's old pocket watch, a reminder of the dreams that had brought her here. You know, Jake said as they planned the day's work over coffee, when you first showed up here, I bet the other guys you'd be gone in a week. I know, she replied with a smile. Tommy told me about the betting pool. Did he tell you I lost $20 when you didn't quit? Best money you ever lost. Jake looked out at the cattle grazing in the morning light, at the mountains that had become as familiar as his own reflection, at the woman who'd gone from being his biggest headache to his most trusted partner. Yeah, he said. Best money I ever lost. The Broken Arrow Ranch was in good hands. And somewhere, Jake thought, an old man who'd lost his dreams to prejudice and fear would be proud to know that his granddaughter had found them again in the wide Montana sky.